The crystal chandelier above the table cast a sharp, unforgiving light. Clara Hayes stared at her half-eaten sea bass, her stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. The restaurant was filled with the low hum of expensive conversations, the clinking of silver against porcelain, the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. It was supposed to be a nice dinner, a third date with Preston Cole to see if there was a real connection. Instead, it was a trap. Preston leaned across the white tablecloth. His smile was perfectly charming, but his pale eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "You are not listening to me, Clara." "I am listening," Clara said. She tried to keep her voice steady to hide the tremor in her chest. "I just think we have different perspectives on this." Preston reached out and clamped his hand over her wrist. His fingers dug into her fragile skin, pressing exactly over her pulse point. The grip was tight enough to bruise disguise to the rest of the room as a lover's intimate touch. "You will learn that my perspective is the only one that matters." Preston lowered his voice. "You have a terrible habit of disagreeing with me. We are going to have to fix that." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into a dull, rushing static. She tried to pull her hand back, but his grip only tightened, sending a sharp ache up her forearm. "Let go of me," she whispered, her voice trembling, despite her best efforts to maintain her dignity. Preston smiled wider, a terrifying expression that sent ice sliding down her spine. "Relax, you are making a scene. Just sit still and finish your wine." He released her wrist slowly, as if doing her a favor. Clara pulled her hand into her lap, her fingers numb. She had seen this before, the subtle isolation, the quiet control. And she needed to leave, right now. "I need to use the restroom," Clara said, pushing her chair back. Preston's eyes narrowed. "Our dessert is coming. I will be right back." She stood up before he could object, grabbing her small clutch. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to walk calmly across the dining room, past tables of oblivious couples. Once she reached the heavy oak door of the ladies' room, she pushed inside, locked the stall, and leaned against the cold tile wall. Her chest heaved as she dragged in a shaky breath. She pulled her phone from her clutch. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely unlock the screen. She needed Harper. Harper lived 10 minutes away. Harper would come get her. She opened her messages, typed in what she thought was Harper's new number from memory, and hit send. "Harper, please help. I am at the Luminaire on 5th. Preston is scaring me. He grabbed me. I am trapped. Can you call with an emergency so I can leave?" She stared at the screen, waiting for the familiar read receipt. Nothing. Through the bathroom door, she heard heavy footsteps approaching in the hallway. "Clara, are you all right in there?" Preston's voice was muffled but dangerously close. He had followed her. "I am fine," she called out, hating the slight crack in her voice. "Just a minute." She looked down at her phone. A message bubbled up. It was not from Harper. "Got your message. Where exactly are you sitting?" Clara froze. The text was from an unsaved number, a completely wrong number. Panic surged up her throat, tasting like copper. "I am sorry, wrong number," she typed frantically. The response came instantly. "I know. I am 2 minutes away. Do not let him know anything is wrong. Stay where you are." Clara stared at the screen. A stranger. She had just sent a desperate SOS to a stranger, and they were telling her to wait. It was absurd. It was terrifying. But as Preston knocked on the bathroom door again, demanding she come out, she realized she had no other choice. "I am coming out," Clara said. She shoved the phone into her purse, squared her shoulders, and unlocked the door. Preston was waiting in the narrow hallway, blocking her path. He looked annoyed, his jaw clenched tight. "What took so long?" "Just freshening up," she said softly, keeping her eyes downcast so he would not see the terror in them. He reached out and traced a finger down her cheek. She flinched, a visceral reaction she could not suppress. His eyes darkened. "Let us go back to the table. We have a lot to discuss." She walked back to their booth, every step, feeling like a march to the gallows. She sat down. Preston sat across from her, his presence suffocating. He ordered her to drink her wine, and she lifted the glass with trembling hands. Then the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. It was not a loud noise or a sudden commotion. It was a drop in temperature, a silent wave of pressure that made the hairs on the back of Clara's neck stand up. The conversations near the entrance stuttered and died. The maitre d' usually composed and haughty scrambled backward. Clara did not turn around, but she tracked the heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching their table. Preston looked up, his arrogant expression faltering into sudden confusion. "Excuse me, this is a private table. I am not here for you." The voice was deep, smooth, and laced with absolute terrifying authority. Clara turned her head. The man standing beside their booth looked like he owned the building, the city, and the oxygen in the room. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that clung perfectly to a broad, muscular frame. His dark hair was meticulously styled, but it was his eyes that made Clara's heart stop. They were dark, cold, and assessing, locked entirely on her. He exuded a ruthless energy, a predator walking into a cage of lesser animals. "Are you Clara?" he asked, his tone dropping into a quieter, more intimate register. She nodded, unable to speak. Preston slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. "Who the hell do you think you are? Get away from my date." The man finally shifted his gaze to Preston. The look was so empty, so devoid of basic human warmth, that Preston actually physically recoiled, pressing his back against the leather booth. "I am Julian Vance," the man said simply. "And she is leaving with me." Clara recognized the name. Everyone in the city knew the name Julian Vance. He was the CEO of Vance Holdings, a billionaire with a reputation for merciless takeovers and a shadowy reach that extended far beyond legitimate boardrooms. He was untouchable, and he was standing here looking at her with quiet possession. "This is insane," Preston stammered, trying to regain his false bravado. "She is my girlfriend. She is not going anywhere." Julian ignored him. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a matte black money clip, and dropped a $100 bill onto Preston's dessert plate. It fluttered down, landing perfectly on the chocolate tart. "For the inconvenience," Julian said. Then he looked down at Clara. He did not grab her. He did not issue a command. He simply held out his large, calloused hand toward her. Clara looked at his hand, then at Preston's red, furious yet terrified face. She reached out and placed her trembling fingers into Julian's palm. His grip was warm, solid, and incredibly gentle. He pulled her to her feet, stepping seamlessly between her and Preston, shielding her completely with his broad back. "Do not ever touch her again," Julian said to Preston, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a death sentence. "Or I will ensure you no longer have hands to touch anyone with." Julian turned and led Clara through the dead silent restaurant. Nobody stopped them. Nobody breathed. Clara felt a strange, dizzying rush of adrenaline as the cool night air hit her face outside. She was holding the hand of the most dangerous man in the city, but for the first time all evening, the tight knot in her chest vanished. The heavy glass door of the restaurant closed behind them, cutting off the suffocating atmosphere. The night air was sharp, biting at Clara's bare shoulders, but she barely felt the cold. Her mind was struggling to catch up with reality. She was standing on the pavement, her hand still engulfed in the warm, solid grip of Julian Vance. Just steps away, a black, heavily armored SUV idled quietly at the curb. A man built like a heavyweight fighter stood by the rear door, his posture rigid. Julian released her hand, the sudden loss of contact making her skin prickle. He gestured to the open door. "Get in." Clara hesitated. Common sense, the same sense that had told her to run from Preston, was now screaming that getting into a car with a ruthless billionaire fixer was an entirely different kind of danger. "I do not even know you," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. Julian's dark eyes softened by a fraction of a millimeter. "You know I am not him, and you know that if you stay on this sidewalk, he will come out here the second I leave. He will follow you home. Men like that do not handle public humiliation well. He was right. Clara knew he was right. She clutched her small purse tightly against her chest, ducked her head, and slid into the back of the SUV. The interior smelled of expensive leather and a faint, clean scent of cedar and bergamot. Julian slid in beside her, leaving a very deliberate, respectful foot of space between them. The heavy door shut with a solid, absolute thud, sealing them inside a quiet, impenetrable vault. "Address?" The driver asked, his eyes briefly meeting Clara's in the rearview mirror. She rattled off her address, a modest apartment complex across the city, entirely out of place in Julian Vance's world. As the SUV pulled smoothly into the traffic, Clara let out a long, shaky exhale. The adrenaline that had kept her standing was rapidly draining away, leaving her limbs feeling like liquid lead. Her hands began to tremble again, shaking so violently she had to interlock her fingers in her lap. Julian watched her in silence. He reached over, opening a small compartment in the center console, and handed her a bottle of water. "Drink. It helps with the shock." She took it of her fingers, brushing his. "Thank you." She managed to unscrew the cap and took a slow sip. The cool water helped ease the painful tightness in her throat. "You sent the message to me by accident," Julian stated. It was not a question. He leaned back against the plush leather seat, the streetlights casting fleeting shadows across the sharp angles of his jaw. "I was trying to text my best friend Harper. I must have misdialed one of the digits in my panic." Clara looked down at her hands. "I am sorry. I dragged you into a mess. You must have better things to do than rescue random women from bad dates." Julian's gaze remained fixed on her. The intensity of his stare made her stomach do a strange, fluttery flip. "I have many things to do, Clara. None of them are better than this." Clara's breath hitched. She looked away, staring out the tinted window at the blurring city lights. "Why did you come?" "You could have just ignored it. Or called the police. Because the police arrive after the damage is done." Julian's voice was calm, but it carried a dark, dangerous undertone. "I arrived before. When I read your message, I knew exactly what kind of man was sitting across from you. A coward who uses isolation and fear to bend women to his will. I do not tolerate men like that." The certainty in his voice sent a shiver through her. It was not just confidence, it was absolute power. The kind of power that could erase problems with a single phone call. "He knows where I live," Clara whispered, the fear creeping back into her chest. "He insisted on picking me up for our second date. If he is as angry as you say, he might come to my apartment." "He will not get anywhere near your apartment." Julian pulled a sleek phone from his inner pocket and tapped out a quick message. "I'm having a security detail stationed outside your building. They will remain there until I am satisfied he is no longer a threat." Clara turned to face him, her eyes wide. "You cannot do that. I cannot afford private security, Mr. Vance." "Julian," he corrected her smoothly, "and I'm not asking for your money. I am giving you peace of mind. Consider it a gift. I do not accept gifts from strangers, especially billionaires with a reputation." A faint, genuine smirk touched the corner of his lips, transforming his harsh face into something devastatingly handsome. "I suppose my reputation precedes me. But I'm not a stranger anymore, Clara. I am the man who is going to ensure you sleep safely tonight." The SUV turned onto her street. The familiar brick facade of her apartment building came into view. Standing nervously on the front steps, illuminated by the flickering streetlight, was a woman with wild curly hair, pacing back and forth with a phone pressed to her ear. "Harper," Clara breathed, relief washing over her. The driver pulled up to the curb. Julian stepped out first, unbuttoning his jacket with a fluid motion, and offered his hand to Clara again. She took it, stepping out onto the cracked sidewalk. Harper stopped pacing and stared, her jaw practically hitting the pavement as she took in the massive armored vehicle, the intimidating driver, and Julian Vance himself, standing protectively beside her best friend. "Clara, what the hell is going on?" Harper ran forward, grabbing Clara by the shoulders and inspecting her for injuries. "You texted me some weird half-sentence an hour ago and then vanished. And who is—" Harper looked up at Julian, her eyes widening in recognition. "Oh my God. You are Julian Vance." "Good evening," Julian said, his tone perfectly polite, but maintaining that impenetrable wall of authority. "I suggest you take Clara inside. Lock the doors. Do not answer if Preston Cole knocks. My men are positioned on the street." Harper nodded dumbly, pulling Clara toward the entrance. Julian reached into his pocket and produced a thick, matte black business card with a single silver crest and a phone number. He handed it to Clara. His fingers lingered on hers for a second longer than necessary. "If he contacts you, if you feel unsafe, if you need anything at all, you call me directly." Clara looked down at the card. It felt heavy in her hand. "Thank you, Julian, for everything." He did not say "you are welcome." He simply gave her one last, piercing look, a look that promised violence to anyone who dared cross her path, and stepped back into the SUV. Clara stood on the sidewalk with Harper watching the black vehicle disappear into the night. "What exactly happened at that restaurant?" Harper demanded, locking her arm through Clara's as they hurried up the stairs. "Because it looks like you just got rescued by the mob boss of Wall Street." Clara looked at the silver crest on the card, her heart still beating wildly against her ribs. "I texted the wrong number," she whispered. The morning sun did nothing to warm the chill that had settled deep in Clara's bones. She sat at her small kitchen table staring at the chipped ceramic mug Harper had placed in front of her. The coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago. "You need to eat something," Harper said, leaning against the counter with a deep frown line creasing her forehead. "You have been staring at that wall since you woke up." "I am fine," Clara lied, her voice raspy. She wasn't fine. The moment she had turned on her phone that morning, it had erupted into a chaotic symphony of notifications. 23 missed calls, 14 text messages from blocked or unknown numbers, all of them carrying the same dark, escalating tone. She picked up the phone with trembling fingers and tapped the voicemail icon. Preston's voice filled the small kitchen, completely stripped of the smooth, charming veneer he had worn at the restaurant. It was raw, erratic, and suffocating. "You think you can humiliate me like that? You think you can just walk out with some arrogant prick and ignore me?" A heavy breath crackled through the speaker. "I know your schedule, Clara. I know you leave the architectural firm at 6. You cannot hide from me. We are going to finish our conversation. You owe me." Harper reached over and snatched the phone from the table, hitting delete. "That is it. We are going to the police, right now. I am not letting you walk to the subway with this psycho stalking you. The police will just tell me to file a report and wait for a judge to issue a restraining order," Clara said, rubbing her temples where a vicious headache was building. "It could take weeks, and a piece of paper is not going to stop Preston. You heard him. He is unhinged." "Then what are you going to do? Hide in this apartment forever?" Clara looked toward her purse where the heavy, matte black business card rested. Asterisk, Julian Vance. The man who had walked into her nightmare and silenced it with a single look. She remembered the warmth of his hand, the absolute authority in his voice. But calling him felt like crossing a line, stepping into a world with rules she did not understand. "I am going to work," Clara decided, pushing her chair back. "I am not going to let him terrorize me into losing my job. Julian said there was security outside. I will be careful." The commute was agonizing. Every shadow in the subway station looked like Preston. Every tall man in a beige trench coat made her heart slam violently against her ribs. When she finally reached her office building, she rushed through the revolving doors, her palms slick with cold sweat. The workday dragged on in a blur of anxiety. Clara could not focus on the blueprints scattered across her desk. Her eyes kept darting to the window overlooking the street. By the time 6 o'clock arrived, the sky had turned a bruising shade of purple threatening rain. The office emptied out quickly, leaving Clara alone with the dreadful realization that she had to walk back to the station. She pulled up the collar of her coat, gripped her pepper spray inside her pocket, and stepped out into the biting wind. The street was unnervingly quiet. Clara walked fast, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the concrete. She was only 2 blocks away from the subway entrance when she heard it. Footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate, and matching her pace perfectly. Her stomach bottomed out. She sped up her breath, coming in shallow, jagged gasps. The footsteps sped up too. Clara. The voice sliced through the cold air like a blade. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. She turned slowly. Preston was standing 10 feet away, emerging from the shadows of a closed storefront. He looked disheveled, his eyes wide and frantic, completely stripped of his corporate polish. I told you we needed to talk," Preston snarled, closing the distance between them. "Stay away from me!" Clara yelled, taking a step back. She fumbled for the pepper spray in her pocket, but her fingers were numb and clumsy. "I will scream. I swear to God, Preston, I will scream. Scream all you want. Nobody cares in this city." Preston lunged forward, his hand shooting out to grab the lapel of her coat. He yanked her toward him, his face twisting into an ugly mask of rage. "You ruined my reputation. You made me look like a fool in front of Julian Vance. Do you have any idea what you have done?" Clara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact of his fist, the stench of his stale cologne suffocating her. But the impact never came. Instead, there was a sickening thud, followed by a sharp gasp of pain. The grip on Clara's coat vanished instantly. She stumbled backward and opened her eyes to a scene that made her breath catch. Preston was on his knees on the wet pavement. Standing behind him were 2 men in identical, impeccably tailored dark suits. One of them had his hand clamped around the back of Preston's neck, forcing him down with effortless, terrifying strength. The other man stepped forward, placing himself perfectly between Clara and the threat. "Miss Hayes," the man said. It was the driver from the SUV the night before. His voice was calm, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Are you injured?" No, Clara stammered, her whole body shaking violently. "I am okay, just... he grabbed me." The driver's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He looked down at Preston, who was struggling and gasping for air against the iron grip on his neck. "Let me go." Preston choked out, his eyes bulging with terror as he finally realized who these men were. "You cannot do this. This is assault." The man holding him leaned down, his voice a lethal whisper. "Mr. Vance sends his regards. He also notes that you have a severe listening comprehension problem. We are here to correct it." The driver turned back to Clara, shielding her vision from what was happening on the ground. "A car is waiting for you at the corner, Miss Hayes. Please get inside. It is not safe for you to remain in the cold." Clara didn't argue. She couldn't. Her legs moved on autopilot as she hurried to the black SUV idling at the intersection. She climbed into the back seat, the heavy door shutting out the violence and the cold. The interior was warm, safe, and silent. She pulled out her phone and dug Julian's black card from her purse. Her fingers shook so badly it took her 3 tries to dial the number. He answered on the first ring. "Are you hurt?" Julian's voice resonated through the speaker. There was no greeting, no hesitation, just a deep, thundering demand for her safety. "No," Clara whispered, a rogue tear finally spilling over her lashes. "Your men. They were right there. He grabbed me, Julian, and they just appeared out of nowhere." A heavy, terrifying silence stretched across the line. When Julian spoke again, the sheer lethality in his tone made Clara's breath hitch. "He touched you." It was a statement cold and finalizing. "He grabbed my coat. But I am okay. Julian, please do not let them kill him. I do not want to be responsible for that." "You are responsible for nothing, Clara. The consequences of his actions belong entirely to him." Julian's voice softened just a fraction, pulling her back from the edge of panic. "I'm sending the car to my building. You are not going back to that apartment tonight. Come to me. Your building, yes." The command was absolute, but wrapped in a layer of profound protection. "It is time you saw where I operate. I will be waiting." The line clicked dead. Clara sat back against the leather seat, her heart pounding a new rhythm. She had just survived a nightmare only to be summoned directly into the epicenter of the city's most powerful empire. And God help her, she could not wait to get there. The black SUV pulled into the subterranean parking garage of Vance Holdings, a towering monolith of steel and dark glass that dominated the city's skyline. Clara felt entirely out of place. Her beige trench coat was damp from the drizzle, her hair was wind-blown, and her sensible work flats seemed offensive against the polished epoxy floor of the VIP garage. The driver opened her door and escorted her to a private elevator. There were no buttons inside. He simply scanned his retina, and the sleek metal box shot upward with stomach-dropping speed. "Mr. Vance is on the top floor," the driver said, stepping back to let her ride alone. "He has cleared the floor for you." The elevator doors glided open with a soft chime. Clara stepped out into a world that smelled of wealth power and high-altitude air. The penthouse floor was vast and silent, paved with imported Italian black marble. Abstract art that likely cost more than her entire life's earnings hung on the pristine walls. At the end of the long corridor was a set of double glass doors partially open. As Clara approached, she heard voices. "This is unacceptable. I do not care what the board thinks. Break the contract, absorb the penalty, and liquidate their assets by morning." It was Julian. His voice was not raised, but the cold, slicing authority in it was enough to make Clara's footsteps falter. She peeked through the glass doors. The boardroom was massive. Julian stood at the head of a long mahogany table, dressed in a custom-tailored navy suit, his tie perfectly knotted, looking like a ruthless king surveying a failing kingdom. 5 older men in expensive suits were seated around the table, all of them pale, sweating, and visibly trembling under his gaze. "No, but Julian," one of the older men stammered, wiping his brow. "The PR fallout will be massive. They have political backing." Julian placed his hands flat on the table and leaned forward. The predatory grace in his movement made the entire room flinch. "I am the political backing, Richard. You work for me, not the press. Get it done, or I will find someone who can." Clara swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. This was the Julian Vance the world feared, a man who destroyed companies before his morning coffee, who wielded power with merciless precision. What was she doing here? She was a normal girl, a mid-level architect trying to pay off student loans. She was entirely out of her depth. She took a half-step backward, intending to retreat to the elevator, but the slight squeak of her shoe gave her away. Julian's head snapped up. His dark, lethal eyes locked onto her through the glass. In an instant, the cold fury in his expression vanished, replaced by an intensity that made her breath catch. He stood straight, buttoning his suit jacket with one hand. He did not look at the executives as he spoke. "Get out! All of you! Now!" The men did not hesitate. They practically tripped over each other, gathering their files, rushing past Clara, with lowered heads eager to escape the suffocating pressure of the room. Suddenly, Clara and Julian were the only 2 people left on the entire floor. Julian walked toward her. Against the backdrop of the city lights glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he looked larger than life. He stopped inches away from her, his towering frame casting a protective shadow over her trembling form. He reached out his knuckles, gently brushing the damp line of her jaw. "You are freezing," he murmured, his voice a stark contrast to the ruthless tone he had used seconds ago. It was deep rough and entirely focused on her. He shrugged off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The heavy fabric engulfed her, carrying his body heat and the intoxicating scent of his cologne. "I am sorry to interrupt your meeting," Clara whispered, pulling the lapels of his jacket closer. "They were dismissed the moment you walked off that elevator." Julian placed a hand on the small of her back and guided her into his private office, a sprawling sanctuary of dark wood leather and silence. He walked over to a crystal decanter and poured a small measure of amber liquid into a heavy glass. He handed it to her. "Drink. It will warm your blood." Clara took a sip. The whiskey burned beautifully down her throat, settling the lingering tremors in her stomach. She looked up at him. What happened to Preston? Your men, they took him. Julian leaned against the edge of his massive desk, crossing his arms. Preston Cole is no longer a concern. His employment at his firm was terminated 30 minutes ago due to an anonymous tip regarding corporate embezzlement. His landlord received a notice of breach of contract. His bank accounts are currently frozen under a fraud investigation. Clara stared at him, her lips parted in absolute shock. You did all that? Since he grabbed me? I did that in the 45 minutes it took my car to bring you here. Julian corrected his gaze, unwavering. He is currently sitting in a bus terminal with a one-way ticket out of state. He was informed that if he ever sets foot in this city again, or if he ever speaks your name, the next consequences will not be financial. They will be physical and permanent. The sheer scale of the retribution left Clara dizzy. It was terrifying. It was absolute overkill, and yet deep in the darkest corner of her heart, it felt like profound poetic justice. For the first time in weeks, she felt entirely, untouchably safe. Why? Clara asked, her voice trembling, but not from fear. I am nobody, Julian. I just sent a text to the wrong number. Why would you go to war for me? Julian pushed off the desk and closed the distance between them. He took the whiskey glass from her loose grip and set it aside, then reached up to cup her face in both of his large, warm hands. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones, his eyes burning with a dark, possessive fire. Because the moment you put your hand in mine at that restaurant, you stopped being a stranger, he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. You endured that coward's humiliation with dignity. You did not break. I look at you, Clara, and I see something rare, something I want. He stepped closer, invading her space until she had to tilt her head back to look into his eyes. But you need to understand what this is. Julian continued, the ruthless CEO bleeding back into his tone. I am not a safe man. My world is built on power leverage and making enemies. I do not play fair, and I do not lose. If you walk back to that elevator right now, I will ensure you have a quiet, perfectly normal life. You will never see me again. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But Julian leaned down his lips, hovering mere millimeters from hers, his breath warm against her skin. If you stay, you belong to me. You step into my darkness, and in return, I will place the entire world at your feet. No one will ever disrespect you. No one will ever hurt you. You will be under my absolute protection. The choice was monumental. It was the crossroad between a safe, mundane existence and a terrifying, high-stakes world where this ruthless billionaire would burn cities to keep her warm. Clara looked at the expensive marble floor, then up into the dark, bottomless depths of Julian Vance's eyes. She let the oversized suit jacket slide off her shoulders, letting it fall onto the leather sofa. She stepped into his chest, resting her hands flat against his thundering heart. I am not leaving, Clara whispered. Julian let out a ragged breath. His arms banded around her waist, lifting her off the floor as his mouth crashed down on hers, sealing the pact with a kiss that tasted of whiskey power and an unyielding promise of protection. The Diamond Conservatory. Charity Gala was the epicenter of the city's elite. It was a world of inherited wealth, sharp smiles, and predatory whispers. Clara stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in Julian's penthouse, staring at a reflection she barely recognized. Julian had not just bought her a dress. He had flown in a designer from Paris to custom fit her in a gown of midnight blue silk. It clung to her curves like liquid sapphire, leaving her shoulders bare, while a delicate cascade of diamonds rested against her collarbone. She looked untouchable. But beneath the silk and the jewels, her hands were trembling. Julian stepped up behind her, his reflection joining hers in the glass. He was devastatingly handsome in a stark black tuxedo. He did not ask if she was nervous. He simply placed his large hands on her bare shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of her neck. "You look breathtaking," he murmured, his voice sending a warm shiver down her spine. "Remember, Clara, you do not bow to anyone in that room tonight. They bow to you." The gala was held in a massive, glass-domed botanical garden, dripping with crystal chandeliers and white orchids. The moment Julian and Clara walked through the double doors, the ambient noise in the ballroom dipped. Hundreds of eyes turned toward them. Cameras flashed blindly from the press corral. Clara felt the crushing weight of their scrutiny, the calculating stares of women in haute couture and men who ruled corporate empires. They were staring at her, the unknown woman holding the arm of the city's most ruthless bachelor. Julian kept her close, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. His presence was an iron shield deflecting the whispers. For the first hour, everything was perfect. Julian introduced her to a few key allies, his tone making it abundantly clear that she was not a fleeting amusement. She was his choice. Then the inevitable happened. "Julian, forgive me, but there is a crisis with the Tokyo merger. We need you for 2 minutes." A frantic-looking board member appeared, sweating despite the air conditioning. Julian's jaw tightened. He looked at Clara, clearly unwilling to leave her side. "Go?" Clara said softly, offering a reassuring smile. "I will be fine. I am just going to get a glass of champagne." Julian hesitated, his eyes sweeping the room for threats. 2 minutes. Do not move from the bar." He kissed her temple and strode away, the crowd naturally parting for him. Clara walked to the marble bar, keeping her posture straight. She accepted a crystal flute of champagne, staring at the bubbles. Well, I suppose Julian always did have a soft spot for charity cases. The voice was sweet, but the underlying venom was unmistakable. Clara turned. Standing beside her was Victoria Sterling, a blonde heiress whose family owned half the commercial real estate in the city. Victoria was draped in gold sequins, looking Clara up and down with an expression of profound, unfiltered disgust. 2 of her sycophantic friends stood behind her, smirking. "Excuse me," Clara said, keeping her voice level. "Oh, do not play coy, darling." Victoria laughed, a harsh, grating sound. She took a step closer, invading Clara's space. "We all know who you are, or rather what you are. A mid-level desk worker. I bet Julian had his assistant buy that dress off the rack for you. Tell me, how much does he pay you to play dress-up and pretend you belong in our world?" The words were designed to humiliate, engineered to strike at Clara's deepest insecurities. A few nearby guests stopped talking, their eyes darting over to watch the spectacle. Victoria was loudly, deliberately putting her in her place. Clara's chest tightened. The old Clara, the girl who had frozen at the restaurant when Preston grabbed her, would have looked away, swallowed her tears, and fled to the bathroom. But Clara was no longer that girl. She remembered Julian's hands on her shoulders. She remembered his promise. Clara took a slow sip of her champagne, holding Victoria's gaze with absolute, unyielding calm. "I belong exactly where I choose to be, Victoria, and judging by how desperately you are seeking my attention, I would say you know exactly who holds the power here." Victoria's smug smile vanished. Her face flushed an ugly, mottled red. "You arrogant little nobody. You are a temporary distraction. Julian will be bored of you by the weekend, and you will go back to whatever pathetic, roach-infested apartment you crawled out of. Finish that sentence, Victoria, and it will be the last thing you ever say in this city." The voice dropped the temperature in the ballroom to absolute 0. Victoria gasped, spinning around. Julian was standing directly behind her. He did not look angry. He looked entirely, terrifyingly dead inside. His eyes were locked on Victoria, with the cold indifference of a man about to squash an insect. He stepped around the trembling heiress and walked straight to Clara. He took the champagne glass from her hand, set it on the bar, and pulled her flush against his side, wrapping his arm possessively around her waist. "Julian!" Victoria stammered, all her false bravado instantly evaporating. We were just getting to know each other." "You were speaking to my future wife," Julian said. his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly dead-silent ballroom. The collective gasp from the surrounding elite was audible. Clara's heart skipped a beat at the title, but Julian's grip kept her anchored. I did not know," Victoria whispered, taking a step back. "Ignorance is not an excuse. It is a liability," Julian stated. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his eyes never leaving Victoria's terrified face. He hit a single button on speed dial. The silence in the room was so profound that everyone heard the voice on the other end answer immediately. "Yes, Mr. Vance." "The Sterling acquisition," Julian ordered smoothly. "I am pulling our funding. Call in the loans on their commercial properties. All of them. Effective midnight." Victoria let out a strangled cry. "No! Julian, please, my father will be ruined. You cannot do this over a misunderstanding." "It is not a misunderstanding," Julian replied, coldly, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "You sought to humiliate the woman I love in a public forum, so I am humiliating your entire bloodline in return. Tomorrow morning the Sterling name will be synonymous with bankruptcy. Now get out of my sight." Victoria burst into tears. Her friends backed away from her as if she were carrying a plague. The heiress turned and fled the ballroom, the sound of her sobbing echoing over the soft instrumental music. Julian did not watch her leave. He turned to Clara, his expression softening instantly as he looked down at her. He lifted his hand gently, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, entirely ignoring the hundreds of billionaires staring at them in absolute terror and awe. "I am fine," Clara breathed, her heart overflowing. "But you did not have to bankrupt her. I would have burned this entire building down if she had made you cry," Julian said simply. He kissed her forehead, claiming her before the entire world. "Let us go home." The dust motes danced in the fading afternoon light of Clara's old apartment. It had only been 3 weeks since she had left this place to stay at Julian's penthouse, but it already felt like a foreign country. The walls seemed closer, the air stale. She was here just to pack the last of her sentimental belongings, some family photo albums, a few favorite books, and her grandmother's quilt. Julian had been vehemently opposed to her coming back here. He had wanted to send a team of movers to pack the entire apartment into boxes and sanitize the place. But Clara had insisted. She needed to close this chapter of her life herself. They had compromised. Julian had to attend a critical emergency board meeting, but his head of security. Marcus was stationed right outside her apartment door in the hallway. Clara taped up a cardboard box, the harsh ripping sound echoing in the empty living room. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead and sighed. She was safe. Marcus was 20 feet away. Julian was a phone call away. Preston Cole was supposed to be states away, completely destroyed and terrified into submission. A sudden sharp scraping noise came from the bedroom. Clara froze. The tape dispenser slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. She held her breath, listening. The apartment building was old, known for its creaking pipes and thin walls, but this sound was different. It was the distinct squeal of rusted metal, the fire escape window. "Hello?" Clara called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Marcus!" No answer. The front door remained shut. Whatever was making that noise was already inside the apartment, bypassing the hallway entirely. Clara's heart began to hammer a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. She backed away from the hallway leading to the bedroom, her eyes darting to the kitchen counter where her phone lay next to her purse. She took a step toward it. A shadow detached itself from the bedroom doorway. Clara let out a choked scream. It was Preston. But he looked nothing like the slick, arrogant man who had grabbed her wrist at the restaurant. He looked feral. His clothes were filthy and wrinkled, hanging loosely on his suddenly gaunt frame. His hair was greasy and unkempt, and his pale eyes were wide with a manic, unhinged desperation. He smelled of cheap alcohol sweat and absolute ruin. "Did you really think you could just throw me away?" Preston rasped, his voice cracking. He took a staggering step into the living room. Did you think you could have your billionaire boyfriend take everything from me, and I would just disappear?" "Preston, stay back," Clara warned, her voice vibrating with sheer terror. She kept moving sideways, inching closer to the kitchen counter. "Marcus is right outside that door. If I scream, he will break it down." Preston let out a hollow, broken laugh. "I know he is out there. I watched him from the alley for an hour. That is why I climbed 6 flights of rusted fire escape stairs. I have nothing left to lose, Clara. My job is gone. My bank accounts are frozen. I am sleeping in a bus station. You ruined my life. You ruined your own life." Clara shot back, her survival instinct fighting through the paralyzing fear. Her fingers finally brushed the cold granite of the kitchen counter. She felt blindly for her phone. Preston saw the movement. His eyes locked onto the device. With a guttural roar, he lunged across the small living room. Clara snatched the phone, her thumb pressing hard on the side button, activating the emergency speed dial to Julian. But before she could lift it to her ear, Preston tackled her. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs in a violent rush. They crashed into the kitchen island, Clara's spine hitting the hard edge of the counter. The phone flew from her hand, skittering across the floor and landing under the dining table. "You bitch," Preston screamed, his weight pinning her against the cabinets. His hands, shaking and desperate, closed around her throat. Clara fought back wildly. She clawed at his face, her nails tearing into his cheek. She kicked her knees, connecting with his ribs. But Preston was running on the sheer adrenaline of a cornered animal. His grip on her neck tightened, cutting off her oxygen. "I am going to make you pay," he hissed, his spit hitting her face. "If I am going down, I am taking you with me. He thinks he can protect you. He is not here." Black spots danced at the edges of Clara's vision. Her lungs burned, begging for air that could not pass through her crushed windpipe. The visceral agony of being overpowered, of being trapped again, flared through her body. But even as she choked, even as her strength began to fade, she did not beg. She kept her eyes locked on his, filled with absolute defiance. From beneath the table, the faint, tinny sound of the connected phone call echoed. "Clara, Clara, talk to me." Julian's voice tore through the speaker, raw with a terror she had never heard from him before. Preston froze for a microsecond, his eyes darting toward the sound of the billionaire's voice. That brief distraction was all Clara needed. She brought her knee up with every last ounce of her remaining strength, burying it directly into Preston's groin. Preston howled in agony, his grip loosening just enough. Clara shoved him back, gasping violently for air, her throat burning like fire. She scrambled backward on the floor, trying to reach the front door. "Marcus!" she screamed, her voice a ragged, tearing sound. Preston recovered faster than she anticipated. He lunged again, grabbing her ankle and dragging her back across the hardwood floor. Clara kicked blindly, tears of sheer panic finally streaming down her face. You are not going anywhere," Preston roared, raising his fist to strike her. Then the world exploded. The heavy, deadbolted front door of the apartment did not just open. It was obliterated. The wood splintered violently inward, the hinges snapping like dry twigs under a force of unimaginable brutality. Marcus rushed through the shattered frame, his weapon drawn, but someone beat him to it. Julian Vance moved into the apartment faster than Clara could comprehend. He was not wearing his suit jacket. His tie was gone. His face was a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated murder. Before Preston could even register the intrusion, Julian crossed the room. He did not punch Preston. He simply reached down, grabbed Preston by the front of his filthy shirt and the belt of his pants, and lifted the grown man entirely off the ground. Preston shrieked a sound of absolute primal fear. Julian hurled him across the room. Preston's body crashed into the drywall with a sickening crunch, instantly dropping to the floor in a heap of broken limbs and groans. Julian did not even look at him. He dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor, sliding forward to gather Clara into his arms. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. His entire massive frame was shaking violently. "I have got you." Julian choked out, his voice completely broken. I have got you. You are safe. He will never ever breathe near you again." Clara clung to Julian's shirt, burying her face in the warm, solid expanse of his chest. Her lungs drew in ragged, agonizing breaths, her throat burning with every intake of air. She was trembling so violently that her teeth chattered against his collarbone. Julian held her tightly, his massive frame forming an impenetrable fortress around her. "I am here," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a raw, terrifying emotion. "I am right here, Clara. You are safe." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. His dark eyes scanned her features, taking in her tear-stained cheeks and the terror still swimming in her gaze. Then his eyes dropped to her neck. Clara felt his entire body go completely unnaturally rigid. The dark red bruises in the shape of Preston's fingers were already blooming across her pale skin. To Julian Vance, those marks were not just an injury. They were a desecration. They were an insult to his protection, a violation of the one thing in the world he valued above his own life. The warmth drained out of Julian's expression, replaced by a cold, abyssal emptiness. The man who had just held her with such desperate tenderness vanished, and the ruthless billionaire fixer took his place. Julian stood up slowly. Across the room, Preston was groaning on the floor, surrounded by the dust and debris of the shattered drywall. He spat a mouthful of blood onto the hardwood and tried to push himself backward, his eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization of what he had just done. Marcus, standing near the ruined doorway with his weapon lowered but ready, did not move. He knew better than to interfere when Julian Vance had that specific look in his eyes. "Julian," Preston choked out, scrambling frantically backward until his back hit the radiator. Wait, please. I just wanted to talk to her. She provoked me. She drove me crazy." "Julian, you have to understand." Julian did not run. He did not yell. He walked across the living room with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator, cornering a wounded animal. The silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by the sound of Julian's expensive leather shoes stepping over the shattered wood of the front door. He reached Preston. Julian raised his foot and brought his heavy, polished shoe down squarely onto the center of Preston's chest, pinning the man to the floor with crushing force. Preston gasped, clawing weakly at Julian's leg. "Please, I am sorry. I will leave. I will never come back." "You were given a choice," Julian said. His voice was not loud, but it resonated with a lethality that made the air in the room feel freezing. You were given a warning. You were offered the mercy of simply walking away with your pathetic life, and instead, you chose to put your hands on my world. Julian leaned down, resting his forearms on his knee, bringing his face inches from Preston's terrified eyes. "Do you know what happens to men who touch what belongs to me?" Julian whispered. "They do not just die, Preston. Death is too quick. Death is a mercy. I do not do mercy." Preston began to sob a pathetic, high-pitched sound of absolute despair. "Please, I will do anything. I am nothing. You already took my job, my money. I have nothing left." "You have your freedom," Julian replied smoothly. "And you have your reputation. I am taking those too." Julian reached into his pocket without looking away from Preston and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number, holding the device to his ear. "Connect me to the district attorney," Julian ordered. He waited for 3 seconds. "Frank, it is Vance. I have a gift for your re-election campaign. A man named Preston Cole. Attempted murder, aggravated assault, and stalking. But that is just the beginning. I am sending a file to your private server in 10 minutes. It contains a complete digital footprint of his offshore accounts, the client funds he embezzled 3 years ago, and the narcotics currently stashed in the trunk of his car." Preston's eyes bulged. He thrashed weakly under Julian's shoe. "No, there are no drugs in my car. You are setting me up. I want him charged to the maximum extent of the law." Julian continued, ignoring the sobbing man beneath him entirely. "I want him placed in a maximum security facility. Deny bail. If he somehow sees the outside of a prison cell before he is an old man, Frank, I will ensure your political career ends in a federal indictment. Am I understood? Julian hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked down at Preston, whose face was now a mask of absolute catatonic horror. He was looking at decades in a concrete cell surrounded by violent criminals, his name utterly disgraced. He had thought he was a powerful man who could manipulate a young woman. He had never realized he was just a bug waiting to be crushed by a titan. "Look at her," Julian commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. Preston turned his head, tears streaming down his bruised face, and looked at Clara. Clara had pushed herself up to a sitting position, leaning against the kitchen cabinets. Her throat ached terribly, but she met Preston's gaze. She did not look scared anymore. The fear had been burned away by the sheer magnitude of the protection surrounding her. She looked at Preston with nothing but cold, absolute pity. "You are nothing," Clara whispered, her voice raspy but steady. "You thought you could break me. But you only broke yourself." Preston squeezed his eyes shut, a pathetic wail tearing from his throat. The profound humiliation, the crushing regret of his own arrogance finally broke his mind. He curled inward, sobbing into the dusty floor. Julian lifted his foot and stepped away in disgust. He looked at his head of security. "Marcus, the police will be here in exactly 4 minutes. Hand him over. Give them the flash drive from my desk." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, stepping forward to haul the weeping broken man off the floor. Julian turned his back on Preston forever. He walked over to Clara, the coldness in his eyes melting away the second he looked at her. He knelt gracefully on the ruined floor, slipping one arm under her knees and the other around her back. He lifted her effortlessly into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "Let us go home," Julian murmured, pressing his lips gently to her forehead. Clara rested her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes as the ruthless billionaire carried her out of the nightmare and into the safety of his world. The penthouse was entirely silent, save for the soft crackle of the fireplace and the gentle hum of the city far below. Clara sat on the edge of the massive king-sized bed, wearing one of Julian's oversized dress shirts. A private doctor summoned by Julian the moment they had left the ruined apartment had just departed after examining her throat, prescribing painkillers, and assuring Julian that there was no permanent damage. Julian was sitting in a heavy leather armchair, pulled right up to her knees. He had not taken his eyes off her for 2 hours. He had washed the dust from her face himself, his large hands incredibly gentle, treating her as if she were made of spun glass. "Does it still hurt?" Julian asked, his voice low and raspy. He reached out his long fingers carefully, ghosting over the dark bruises coloring her neck, completely avoiding putting any pressure on her skin. "Only when I swallow," Clara said softly. Her voice was hoarse, but a warm, profound sense of peace had settled over her. "I am okay, Julian. I really am." Julian dropped his hand and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked down at the plush rug, a heavy, dark shadow crossing his features. "I was almost too late. When I heard him struggling with you over the phone, Clara, I have never known fear like that. My entire empire, my money, my influence, none of it meant a damn thing in those 3 minutes." Clara slid off the edge of the mattress, kneeling on the rug between his legs. She placed her hands on his thighs, forcing him to look up at her. "But you were not too late. You came for me. You saved me. I brought the danger to you." Julian corrected, his eyes burning with intense self-reproach. "If you had not associated with me, he might have eventually backed off. My world, my arrogance, it escalated him. I told you I would protect you from the darkness, and instead I let it walk right through your front door. Preston was a monster long before I met you," Clara said firmly. "You did not make him do anything. You stopped him." Julian reached out and cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. The fierce, possessive love in his gaze took her breath away. "I am stepping down," Julian stated. The words were heavy, carrying the weight of a monumental shift in the universe. Clara's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" I mean the shadowy deals, the fixers, the intimidation tactics. All of it. It ends tonight, Julian said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. I have spent the last decade building a reputation as a monster, in a custom suit, because it was the only way to survive in this city. But I will not bring that violence into your life. I will not have you looking over your shoulder. I am liquidating my questionable assets. Vance Holdings is going entirely legitimate. Julian, Clara whispered, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his sacrifice. You are giving up your power. I am trading fake power for real peace, he corrected softly. He leaned his forehead against hers. You are my world now, Clara, and I refuse to let my world live in the dark. I want to stand in the light with you. Tears pricked the corners of Clara's eyes. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, holding on to the man who was willing to dismantle his entire universe just to ensure she felt safe. 6 months later, the rain lashed against the small barred window of the state penitentiary. Preston Cole sat on the edge of a thin, lumpy mattress in his 6x8 concrete cell. He wore a faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his emaciated frame. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and devoid of the arrogant spark that had once defined him. He stared blankly at a crumpled month-old newspaper his cellmate had tossed onto the metal table. On the front page of the society section was a sprawling, high-definition photograph. It was Julian Vance, looking impossibly powerful in a bespoke tuxedo. And standing beside him, radiant and untouchable, was Clara Hayes. She was wearing a stunning designer gown, smiling up at Julian with a look of pure, unadulterated love. The headline read, "Billionaire Julian Vance announces philanthropic shift as he prepares to wed architect Clara Hayes." Preston's hands shook as he stared at the picture. He traced the outline of Clara's smiling face with a filthy fingernail. The crushing weight of public humiliation, the sheer agony of his monumental regret, pressed down on his chest like a physical boulder. He had tried to manipulate a smart, beautiful woman, and in doing so, he had handed her over to a titan who gave her the world. He had traded his freedom, his career, and his life all for nothing. Preston dropped his head into his hands, the cold, echoing silence of the prison mocking the quiet sobs that tore from his throat. He would spend the next 20 years in this cage, entirely forgotten by a world that Clara now ruled. Miles away, high above the glittering skyline of the city, Clara stood on the sprawling terrace of the penthouse. The evening air was warm, smelling of rain and distant jasmine. She leaned against the glass railing, watching the city lights flicker to life below. She was no longer a terrified girl trapped in a restaurant booth. She was the lead architect at a prestigious firm, a position she had earned entirely on her own merit, and she was fiercely, profoundly loved. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Julian pulled her back against his solid chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck, pressing a soft kiss right over the spot where the bruises had long since faded. "What are you thinking about?" Julian murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her skin. "I am thinking about how crazy life is." Clara smiled, leaning back into his embrace. "If I had not messed up that text message, if I had typed Harper's number correctly, I would have never met you. Then I would have spent the rest of my life looking for you." Julian replied effortlessly, turning her around in his arms to face him. The city lights caught the devastatingly handsome angles of his face. He looked peaceful. The ruthless edge that had once defined him had softened into a quiet, unwavering strength. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Clara's breath hitched, her heart skipping a beat. Julian did not drop to one knee. He simply looked into her eyes, his gaze holding all the intensity and devotion of a man who had finally found his home. He flipped the box open. Resting on the dark velvet was a flawless emerald-cut diamond, surrounded by a halo of smaller stones that captured the light and threw it back in a dazzling display of wealth and beauty. "I promised you my protection," Julian said, his voice low and steady. "I promised you my loyalty. But I want to give you my name, Clara. I want you to be my wife. I want to spend the rest of my days making sure you never know a moment of fear again." Clara looked at the ring, then up into the eyes of the billionaire who had walked through hell to keep her safe. Tears of absolute joy spilled over her lashes. "Yes," Clara whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Julian, I will marry you." Julian let out a long, shaky breath. He slipped the heavy, perfect diamond onto her trembling finger, claiming her completely and permanently. Then he pulled her into his arms, kissing her under the endless sky high above a city that belonged entirely to them.